Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Inside Nebraska podcast. I'm Zack Carpenter. He's Greg Smith. And Greg, what else are we talking about today but the Nebraska Coach Search? We're at day 72 officially of the Coach Search, and like we keep saying, it's a marathon. It feels like two marathons rolled into one, but we're inching closer toward the finish line. It's Monday, November 21st. And we're just going to get right into it. We're talking all this week about some hot topics around the coach search. Sunday, we put out a video on our YouTube channel and on our site about should Nebraska announce a hire before the end of the season? Should they have already done it going into the Wisconsin game? You can check out that. That's already been posted. But today, our main topic is what are the priorities, the first priorities for the new head coach, whoever it is. What does he need to do from the moment he walks in the building? What's at the top of his list? So I have a lot of thoughts on this. I wrote down in my notes some of my details and thoughts, and the notes were longer than normal for podcast prep. But Greg, I'll let you hit from the tee box here. Lead us off. What do you think is the main priority for when a new head coach gets to town?
Man, this is there's a lot here, like you kind of said, with kind of, just jotting things down. You could probably come up with a good 10 at least things that you could go. But the number one thing to me, is as soon as the new coach is hired, is honestly meet with the current team. And this is going to be a multi-layered reason. One, and we know that always happens, right? That's not like something that would not happen. But the reason is that you're gonna want to, from day one as a new coach, kind of walk a tricky line of saying, basically, I'm the new sheriff in town, and we got to establish the culture that I'm trying to build to and the reasons that I was hired and that sort of thing. But you also have to pay respects or be respectful towards Mickey Joseph and the job that he has done over these last, couple of months since September, 11th, 12th, when he, kind of became the interim coach. And so the initial thing, and a couple of things that are always buzzwords around here, culture and buy-in, that very first meeting is going to go a long way, I think, to kind of establishing that buy-in piece of it, and I think that'll be really important, because, and it'll also depend, of course, on who the name is, because you want that instant name recognition. I know a lot of fans want that, but don't kid yourself, that matters to players as well. Eventually, they'd have to get over it if they did not have that initial kind of, big reaction. But I think having a meeting with the players and getting the groundwork built, or the groundwork laid for that initial buy-in and the type of culture that you want to get flipped to at Nebraska is like super important to me.
Yeah, honestly, I hadn't even thought about meeting with the team. I mean, that would be his first priority. So that was it's a good point you make, because for me, one of the first priorities, if not the number one, it'd be right at the top of the list, is evaluating the current roster, which we've talked about, and Mickey has talked about in his press conferences, of needing some more depth and needing more competition at certain spots. And so for me, from sort of an on-field evaluation, it's looking at that roster, seeing who fits, who doesn't. But yours kind of ties in with mine, because it's like you said, the buy-in, who's in, who's out. This is how I'm going to run my program. This is sort of the lay of the land. And so that's a good point. I mean, sort of along those lines, I mean, Mickey Joseph has sort of laid a foundation for this program of that open door policy that we always talk about. And there's some trust and confidence there. Will the new head coach carry that with him? Will he build on that, or is he going to come in here and run a different type of ship? So getting in there to meet the guys and see who's in, who's out, who, from a character evaluation standpoint, that's important. From an on-field standpoint, it's that evaluation of the roster. And we talked about this after the Wisconsin game. I wrote a column that's on nebraska.rivals.com about the Wisconsin series. They've lost it's been 10 years since they beat Wisconsin, 8 years since they beat Iowa. And it all starts in the trenches for Nebraska, offensive line and defensive line. Iowa and Wisconsin build their program on toughness, physicality, and winning in the trenches. And Mickey and Trev Alberts have both said it multiple times that one of the pillars that they want for this program is built on winning in the trenches, like winning the line of scrimmage. And so that ties in with the evaluation of every single player on the roster. And that's where, and we'll get to in a second, of having a staff in place becomes so important, right?
Right. Hmm.
Because I mean, the new coach, he's going to have a detailed evaluation of notebook on every single player on that roster. But the first week he's in town, he might even get it on the private jet that he flies into Lincoln. I mean, you have Vince Ginta and every other staff member who has the lowdown on all those, on
Hmm.
every single player from an on-field standpoint and off-field standpoint. And I know that a lot of people, especially on our message boards, just the fan base in general, wants to pretty much completely overhaul and gut the roster. But maybe whoever this new coach is, maybe he sees something in one of the players that hasn't hit their ceiling, hasn't gotten everything out of them to say, I see something in that player, whether it's technique or measurables, whatever the case is, that I know exactly how to coach that player. I know how to get the most out of him. Or maybe the new coach's assistant, at each position, will be able to look at that and say, hey, I know he hasn't been playing well. I know he's not maxing out, but I have a technique. I know how to get to that player.
Yeah, and I think that's super important because you can't eventually, and this is a bigger picture discussion, but not for this for these purposes. Eventually, Nebraska has to get away from 20 transfers in a given cycle and overhauling the roster in that way, and they have to get back to something else that Trev Alberts has mentioned, developmental program, right? And being, I think he term it, and I think this maybe at like Big Red Breakfast maybe a few weeks back, of like being the premier developmental program in the Midwest. I think that is something that if you want to be that and you're striving for that, you have to be able to look at some of those guys on the roster and say, how can I maximize what's happening here? And we don't need to name them, but there are plenty of guys on the roster that either had high recruiting rankings that you feel like have underperformed to this point in their career, or guys that were even lower ranked that just need a chance to be able to get out there and play and be developed. Because what do we always say about Nebraska football as it relates to recruiting and development? The development piece has just been missing, right? And so if you do have a coach that has an eye for that, and he hits the ground running to evaluate the roster, which he's going to have to do, because you're going to not only need to know what you have on the roster and how you can get more out of guys, or if, we don't like to say this, but they need to be encouraged to leave the program, or you also need to do that so that you can then see what needs you have to then either go into the portal or into high school or probably JUCO recruiting to figure that out. Yeah, that piece of it is vitally important. And one other thing that I thought of when we were talking about kind of meeting the team, and you mentioned about Mickey Joseph saying that the open door policy and how that has helped, and the team has kind of mentioned that too, right? One thing that the new coach would want to do, especially, and you would definitely do it if you're keeping, any of these guys on, is you kind of want to pick the brains of some of the current assistants, right?
Exactly. Yep.
So if you want to be able to go, and you would definitely do this if like Mickey is staying around, you want to go, like one of the first things you're going to say in that meeting after saying you're hired, you're staying, is, so tell me about what you did when you took over that worked. Because something is like, while the losses continue to pile up, there is something good, I think, happening under the surface with the program right now. And I think that picking Mickey's brain to figure out what those things were versus what he saw when he first came to the program, back in January or December, then what has happened? What can you tell me that I need to know?
And this ties in with my other priority I wanted to talk about with Mickey, but I I wanted to say this point that I don't know this for a fact, obviously. Neither of us does, but if Mickey is not retained, just the way he talks and about the players and how close he is with them, he says, I see these guys as my sons. I purely wondered if, even if he is not retained, if he still would give some of his input to the new head coach,
Yeah.
just because I know that he wants to see these players, these guys be successful. I wonder if he would still give his input, just like on sort of like on his way out the door type of deal, be like, hey, here's
Right.
so and so, so and so. This kid's a real, this kid can play, this kid can't. Like this is a great, this is a great kid. This guy needs some, upbringing or whatever word you want to use. I wonder if that would happen. I'm curious about that. But when we're talking about priorities, I'm not usually a proponent of the new head coach has to keep one of the current assistants on
Right.
staff. But you talk about the player, we talk about the player evaluation, and what better way to hit the ground running than to keep a guy like Mickey Joseph or a Bill Bush, Brian Applewhite even on staff. I mean, that could lead to this program is not going to get turned around in a year. It might not be turned around in 2 years. You might be looking at a 3, 4 year deal, but that would be a hell of a way to hit the ground running in year one is to retain Mickey Joseph, who he's on record as saying that he wants to stay. And I think just from everything he said about recruiting, he's an ambitious recruiter, maybe a little too ambitious at times, but that's
Maybe.
that's what Nebraska fans are. They're too ambitious at times as well for some of the goals of this program, and you're going to get it back to some sort of semblance of what it used to be and be a consistent competitor in the Big Ten um, through recruiting, through the ground up, and then obviously on top of that, player evaluation, which you've talked about before. But on top of the recruiting standpoint, if you retain Mickey, you have a much better chance of retaining guys like Casey Thompson, Trey Palmer. You keep the recruiting class, a really good 23 wide receiver class intact of
Yep.
especially Malachi Coleman, who we've talked about many times, is arguably the biggest in-state recruiting when they've had in the last 5, 10 years, and he's not gonna stay. At least I don't think that he's gonna stay in the class without Mickey involved in some sort of way. But I mean, I have a million other just like notes about retaining Mickey, why that would be a good thing, or Bill Bush or Brian Applewhite. What are your thoughts on that?
One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot here in the last few days on that point is, and it's not just about Mickey, but I do think that Mickey is, I think, clearly the top choice for someone that you would want to retain from the assistant coaching staff. You mentioned a good phrase, hitting the ground running, right? It's a compressed timetable of when, as all of this has happened, there's only going to be a couple, like it'll be less than a month. We're now a month until the signing period opens up, right? And so there's a lot of time. We still don't have a coach name. It won't probably happen until the end of this week at the earliest. And so you're going to not only want to keep a Mickey Joseph around, potentially a Bill Bush, potentially Brian Applewhite, so that you have that transfer of kind of knowledge and coaching, and those guys are all ace recruiters. You're also going to probably want to keep some of those behind the scenes guys, right? So we've talked, Vince Ginta is a name that has come up quite a bit on our various podcasts, and we've mentioned him in articles before as the senior director of recruiting and player personnel, the very long title that he has, but he's a rock star at his job. He is. And so keeping a guy like that, and maybe another guy or two in that recruiting department, to either, it's not just because they need to bridge the gap of this time, but also because you don't want to have to start over, right? And those guys are good at their job. Like it's a situation where, when a staff changes like this and a head coach is fired, that doesn't mean that everyone in the building isn't any good. Like I think that what we saw with the transfer from Riley to Frost is actually abnormal, and things have changed so much now because of the fact of the early signing period and the transfer portal window. You're going to want to keep some of that institutional knowledge around. And also, like I said, again, I'll reiterate it, is there are people that are very good at their jobs that can still be part of the solution and the turnaround for Nebraska football.
Yeah, and I'm glad you hit on the point that those guys are good at their jobs as far as
Yeah.
we talk about retaining players if Mickey or Bill Bush and whoever else is still on staff, but they're also really good coaches. I mean,
Yeah.
Mickey is seen as a recruiting guy, but he's also a hell of a wide receivers coach. Brian Applewhite's known as a respected, really good running backs coach, and Bill Bush, you can see he inherited one of the worst defenses in the country, probably the worst or at the bottom in the Big Ten, and has turned that into a respectable unit that's been playing really well every game that he's been the defensive coordinator, with the exception of the Purdue game where things got out of hand.
Right.
And the one caveat that I wanted to mention is when you bring in a situation like Mickey's at, where he was the interim coach for as long as he had, it's going to be what, 9 games by the time it's all said and done. And he's highly respected as the voice and leader of this program right now in that locker room, well liked and respected by the players. You have to make sure that whoever the new head coach is, it depends on who the new head coach is. You have to get a type A personality in there who is not going to have any sort of hesitancy or self-doubt, nerves, whatever, that he is the guy that the players are going to listen to him. And it's not when
Right.
adversity hits, which it will hit hard in the off
Yeah, it is naturally it happens. Yeah.
that there's not going to be any sort of split where it's half the guys are looking toward Mickey, they're looking toward Mickey to be the leader, and half of them are looking at the new guy to be the leader. Like the example that I had been thinking about for a couple weeks, and they also mentioned this on the Gary Sharp show in the last week of I think Wednesday's episode, whenever it was. And after they made this point, I was going, yes, exactly. Like that's exactly what I've been thinking about for a little while, was the example of Dante Williams at USC last year. He took over
Perfect
as interim
example.
coach, and then you bring in Lincoln Riley, who was an unquestioned, no doubt about it, face of the program, leader of the program,
Mhm.
was not afraid to keep on Dante Williams to his staff. He kept him, and it worked wonders for them. I mean, in recruiting, they immediately got.
Guy who had been here, like again, Nebraska fans well aware of him, and some pushed to keep him around when he got fired. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make that point of maybe that's not the norm, but that's a situation where it was pretty clear that they should keep on the guy who took over as interim, and they did, and it worked out wonders for them. I mean, immediately in the recruiting landscape, and then going forward.
Yeah, that, and I think that's a great call out of that situation and how that can work for you, and how you can kind of keep that continuity, but also not be afraid to keep someone that's very popular on the staff already. And I think that it would actually, and it's not like we said off the top, it's not a requirement. And I generally don't stump for people to like get to stick around on new staffs. I understand how tricky that can be, but I also think that it would be an interesting show of like maturity and just kind of comfort in your own skin by the new coach if one of the first acts is to say, hey, we're going to retain Mickey Joseph. I know he was extremely popular, and he has a lot of backing on this team, but does not have to be something that I run away from. I can embrace that. Not every coach is comfortable doing that, and so I think that would be a really positive thing.
Yep, and we're running a little long here, but two final points just to make before we get out of here is, I mean, with Mickey, it's if the new head coach does want to retain him, I mean, it's going to come down to what he wants to do, and if the school, the new staff, makes it worth his while. I mean, it's going to require a pay bump, and he's not a coordinator. Or my guess is that he will not have any sort of coordinator title in it if he is retained on the new staff. But so you're going to be having to pay a pretty penny to keep him around as a receivers coach, as a position coach, probably more than probably higher dollar amount than a lot of other position coaches across the country who don't have a coordinator title in their name. But maybe he keeps the associate head coach title. He has the passing game coordinator title as well in his roles. And then the other thing, I mean, again, I have so many notes on here, but trying to keep it compressed. And but one thing is that I did want to mention was the strength and conditioning program is going to need an overhaul. But the reason I think that we're probably not talking about that as much is because traditionally, when a new head coach comes in, he's going to bring in his own strength and conditioning guy anyway. I mean, I don't think it's the norm to keep the old regime there intact. So I just want to mention that as one final point. But anything else before we get out of here?
No, I love that as a final call out, because I think that that's one of the things that I feel like it's hard to kind of talk about because you just don't ever have enough information about people's methods and all of that. But I think that it's a huge portion of what's going to have to happen with this team going forward, is kind of revamping that. And we've seen that happen. Remember a couple of weeks ago at Michigan, there was a whole deal about how their offensive line kind of got together with the strength staff and said, we need to lean up and be quicker. And they've got one of the best offensive lines, definitely definitely in the Big Ten, if not the country. So you can see those kind of turnarounds happen with the good old gains with the new staff.
Yeah, get me in there. Let me add them. Let me teach them my methods. But yeah, we're inching toward the finish line. I know I keep saying that phrase, but
we're getting there.
are. We're getting toward the end here. Last home stretch of the Nebraska Coaching Search. Again, check us out on nebraska.rivals.com and our Inside Nebraska YouTube channel. We'll have some more of these videos leading up to when the head coach is officially announced, whoever that may be, hitting on some more hot topics. So until then, for Greg Smith, I'm Zack Carpenter, and we will catch you guys again next time.